Hey everyone, and welcome to the newest Octatrack tutorial. This week I want to bring you a new use that I ended up kind of falling into because I was helping out a friend of mine. My friend Tolliver is a singer who asked me to run some tracks for him for a show he was playing, and we ended up opening for Kate Tempest, who's like this poet from the UK, and she's amazing. And we played at Terragram Ballroom about, I want to say a week or two ago, maybe last week. Lost track of time. But in any case, we ran into some issues with getting the stems back, and so I ended up having to use just his instrumental track. So all I had was instrumental tracks of each of his songs. And seeing that, I decided to take the opportunity to see how much the Octatrack can do with just effects. And so I just wanted to demonstrate to you what I ended up doing with that, and show you that you don't really need to do, all that much with the Octatrack to get some really awesome results. So I just kind of want to lay some foundational elements to how I designed this this project. Since I had only an instrumental track, there wasn't a ton I could do with, say, mixing. So I wanted to make sure that everyone on stage could still navigate where we were in the song. So I didn't do any manipulation of the actual timing of the track. The tracks basically started and ended at the same time, no matter when we rehearsed or how we rehearsed. And so that allowed Tolliver to sort of like get a good idea of the timing and all of that stuff. So all of the elements that I added to the track are kind of just on the master. So I'm going to give you some foundations on how I did that. The main pieces of this are I have a master channel, I have my 8th track set to master, and I have two effects per track. So I used reverb for this one and distortion. I kept my filter on the actual track 4, which is where I kept all of my instrumental tracks. There's the filter, and then I also had a delay effect. The reason being that I wanted to use delay first before applying it to reverb and distortion. That's just a personal preference. So if you end up being in a situation like this, feel free to juggle those around. Additionally, I wanted to make sure that the project, I should also add that the project I only had like maybe 2 weeks to get ready for this show. So that definitely influenced a lot of what I ended up doing in the end. So it's basically when I got the instrumental tracks, I threw them into Ableton and I synced them all up to the tempos that they were originally. I had to figure that out through Ableton because we didn't get the BPMs. But basically I figured out all of those, and then I created an arrangement which involved labeling each track one by one using these reminders in the arrangement view. And each track is basically set to play 64 times of the pattern, and that's actually just a safeguard. It's not actually like the number, but this is the maximum number of repetitions you can have of a pattern. And I did that so that I could just not worry about how long the pattern was going to go. I manually stop each track after it's done, and then I also set the BPM to the BPM that I discovered via Ableton. And this is nice because now I don't have to worry about remembering what BPM to switch it to. And all of my delays and other sequenced elements on top of the track will be perfectly in sync. I also want to add that I only used a single bank. In previous videos that you may or may not have watched, I have a tendency to use one bank per track because I like to use multiple parts. In my own sets, this is because I don't really want to be doing too much on the Octatrack. The main focus for me is singing and playing the instruments. So I need parts to switch up what presets I'm playing on my keyboard. I need them to give me something to do with the crossfader without actually manually choosing what those things are, because that uses up too much of my mental CPU. If I'm performing live, I don't want to be thinking about, oh yeah, what is scene 13 and like what effect am I going to create? Obviously, I could get used to that, but personally, I've found it to be a lot more useful to just use banks so that if the arrangement calls for a particular moment to have a particular scene, then it'll happen automatically, and all I have to do is play with the crossfader. In this particular instance, though, I didn't have to worry about singing or anything like that. So I also didn't add a keyboard to this setup. So I didn't have my OP1 or anything like that. So all I was doing was manipulating the scenes. And because of that, I wanted to narrow things down to a single part so that if I changed the scenes on one song, they would apply to all the other songs. And so then I could generate this 16 scene part where I get more and more familiar with what each part does, or what each scene does to the track. And then I would slowly build up a familiarity with that, so that I could be performing the tracks as they're happening. In order to do this, though, since like one thing that's nice about banks is that you get a lot of opportunities to assign different default files and different default settings. Basically, I had to make sure that the baseline of each track was the same. So I have all of my effects in scene 1. I have all of my effects set so that nothing is affecting the track. And I wanted to make sure that scene 1 was kind of an anchor point, so that anytime I want to go back to the way that the track sounded in the studio recording, I could just switch back to scene A, and everything would be removed. Additional to that, if I'm playing tracks, you'll notice that no matter what track I'm playing, I'm still getting different tracks, even though this one isn't changing, this default track. And the way I did that was just by using a one-shot, a P-lock on the track to make sure that it was assigned to the exact track. That sort of thing. And so this allowed me to keep a single part, and then as I was getting more familiar with the whole project, I could say, you know, be playing with this, and then like choose this distortion effect. And if I didn't like it, I could tweak it a little bit, or like add additional elements. And then over time, I could save that single part and get a set of effects that I could use for all of the tracks. So that was kind of the main goal, was to create a set of 16 scenes that had their own uses throughout the set. And so I could sort of manipulate the track and use this as like a multi-effects processor. All right, so let's just dive into one particular track. So I'm going to start from, I'm going to start with scene 2, because the thing about scene 2 is that it doesn't actually do anything, which is why I set it to default scene 2 on all of my rows in my arrangement. And the reason I want this scene is because it actually affects these 3 tracks. Now these 3 tracks are initially not using any material. There's actually a couple tracks where I have pre-arranged sequences. And so in this particular case, I've set up one flex machine for this kind of like note sound. So I would use it for layering. So this pattern has been pre-designed to play the same melody as what I heard in the song, and then I can adjust it. Since it's pitch locked, I can adjust the timing to change the pitch, and it has its own delay that I can. But you'll notice it goes away with scene 1. And that's just to reiterate one of the design philosophies of this project, which was the scene A has to be exactly the same as what the track was from the beginning. Because I noticed as I was designing more and more scenes, it became easy to get lost in what was going on and then to not know how to get back to the original. So I have scene A just stuck with the default. And the reason the way that I did that with these tracks was I assigned scene A to choose the cross volume to be at minimum. And this allows me to mute the signal. You'll notice that you can still hear the delay tail on track 1. And that's because I'm using cross volume instead of cross level. If I was using cross level, you would cut the delay. And I'd prefer to use it this with cross volume because then it gives me some performative capabilities. So like if I'm doing this, I can add some little elements like that. So going from there, I'm just going to start from scene 16 and work my way back because that's the order in which I actually designed these effects. So I was kind of like thinking the basic effects that you'd want during most sets are like high pass, low pass, reverb, delay. So these are kind of the places where I decided to put them was at the very end because I can switch between these with one hand. So this is very much just based on like what's easiest to accomplish. Although because I was focused on this one item, I always had two hands available since I wasn't playing a keyboard or anything. So this first one is a high pass. Pretty standard. Then this next one is just reverb. What's nice about this reverb is that it's also set to send, which allows me to add reverb to like one particular sound, just kind of bleed it in. So I'll show you. These next few scenes are also that way. I use delay for them. So then from there, I have my default 48 setting, and then I switch to 32. This one's a triplet. And then 16. And it was fun to kind of like perform this and create weird effects in between the settings. Going from there, 10 is like a sort of a whiteout reverb. Sorry, I'm dealing with a bit of a cold. All right, so next up we've got scene 9, which is kind of like a super distorted effect on the distortion of the master. I think I recently just adjusted it so that it would have that. Actually. And just a reminder, if I ever didn't like the way an effect turned out, I could just reload the part. Or if I really liked the way it turned out, then I could save it and save all the parts. Well, that's just by default, I save all the parts, but since I'm working only on one part, I could just save that one. 8 was interesting because I started using an LFO for 8, and this is basically a little wavy pitch LFO. This allowed me to generate some cool effects. And so you can see how you can sort of cobble these together to perform live. 6 and 7 are basically low passes. This one has still a little bit of it coming out, and this one is cool because it has a little bit of a tail on it that pitches up. Just kind of like a fade out to light reverb. 5 is interesting because it's a rate, but it will fuck up your sequence. So I usually saved 5 for like the end of a track. All right, so now we're left with 3 and 4, and these were the last 2 scenes that I designed. I probably came up with them like a day or 2 before the night of the performance. And that was when I started to get a bit more bold about my choices because I had kind of become comfortable with where these were. And I introduced these 2 tracks as elements of something that I went over in the past video. One video right before this, I talked about using LFOs to choose the slice that a sequence is referring to. So I'm not going to get into too much detail. If you want to get sort of a breakdown of what I'm talking about, definitely check out the video that came out right before this. But in a nutshell, you can take an LFO, set it to the start point of your track, of your file, and instead of choosing the default start point, sort of like having it be, say, so like if I create all these trigs, they'll all be hi-hats. I'm just going to do a couple other things to demonstrate this. So notice that this is set to slice 8. If I increase the depth, then I start to see it choosing based on the position of the LFO. And I can increase the depth to get more options. So this is a really easy way to sort of like introduce some variation. And I would play with things like the length. And then you could play. So one of the cool things about this setup is since I have my scene A locked to X volume minimum, that means I can remove this pattern just by sliding to the left. But since it's actually defaulted to play, then any of these other tracks will have it inside. So I ended up using it as kind of a as a drum break a lot of the time. It's easier to tell when the rhythm's playing. And then I would combine that with things like the distortion. And then reload the part just to get back to square one. And you'll notice that the LFO has returned once I reset the part. Another thing that I enjoyed doing was increasing the trig speed, or trig number. You can create some glitchy effects there. Is there anything else I'm missing? Yeah, and then I did basically the same thing with this track. So this track was pre-sliced, just a bunch of hits. So even if I didn't adjust, I basically purposely set it so that scene 2 was not LFO affected, so I could manually do that if I wanted to on scene 2. But I also have scene 4 set so that the start point is right in the middle of the number of slices I have. And the depth is exactly how many slices I have. So the saw wave will basically move below and above that midpoint. And I actually had a lot of fun assigning scenes that would do this to, let's see if I had any actually in here. Did I not? Oh. Well, like during a show, I would find a lot of fulfillment in just going like this and being like, oh, now my distortion is gonna do this to the, oh, actually that's the wrong file, sorry. If I'm over here, yeah, so during my distortion scene, I ended up locking the depth of the LFO and the start point because it created a pattern that I liked. But also note that when you're moving the crossfader, say if I have the depth set to 28 and the start point set to 10, and the default is not that, then moving this crossfader hits points in between those two. So in the middle, it'll probably set the start point to slice 9, and the LFO will be set to like 14. And so you end up with an entirely different set of patterns. So you can kind of like stick. So you get different patterns every single time you move it. So you get the kind of picture there. That's pretty much everything. This track I didn't end up actually using all that much, but it's basically a carbon copy of this one, except instead of using the drum rack, it's using a loop that I have, and so it has a similar effect. So say you've got this track. And it has a delay instead of a... pretty underwhelming, which is why I didn't use it. But I could totally imagine in future performances maybe having a singer's voice be processed through here, set the cue to go out to the mixer as the vocal, and then utilize that within the Octatrack as like a sample base. So say somebody records like a 2-bar phrase, or I manually trigger it, and then I can slice that up and then be doing the exact same thing I was doing with this, except with somebody's voice. So like a lot of different interesting things you could do with that particular technique. I didn't really want to get too complicated with it because it's the first time I've actually used an Octatrack this way as just an effects processor. So I really wanted to just make sure that everything ran smoothly first. But it ended up working out really well. The show was awesome. Kate Tempest came up afterwards and was like, that was amazing, to both of us. So I like to think she was also complimenting the Octatrack. Who knows? But in any case, I think it worked out really well. And it's a really nice way to keep track of where everything is, only get used to like one set of scenes in one part so your head doesn't explode, and to have a lot of fun with just one track at a time. So yeah, if anybody has any other suggestions about like how they might have tried something like this, feel free to let me know in the comments or ask any questions, please do. And hope you enjoyed this one, and till next time, thanks for watching.